It was the year 584. The king went hunting, but he did not return alive, as the queen wished it so, preferring to get rid of her husband in order to stay with her secret lover. And the wrath of the gods caught up with this power-hungry, cruel, calculating woman. She lost 3 children, heirs to the throne. And no, you didn't guess, this is not about Cersei Lannister. You have one more attempt. Having found herself at court in the role of a servant concubine, she captivated the ruler and became the most powerful woman and intriguer in the kingdom. And no, it is not Hurrem Sultan who, coming to the sorrow of Merabini, became the ruler of the Ottoman Empire. In this episode, we will talk about the Middle Ages, a time that was dark and turbulent, certainly not boring, full of intrigues, wars, and vibrant personalities. Among the most colorful figures of that era were undoubtedly the 2 queens Brunhilda and Fredegund. Their rivalry and ambitions became true legends, and their stories are worthy of series and novels. Essentially, it was a real Game of Thrones during the era of the Merovingians. And by the way, the creators of the series were largely inspired by the events we will discuss today. And before we move on to this historical saga, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the listeners and viewers of this channel for your support and attention. If you enjoy our episodes, be sure to subscribe to this channel, as well as to our Telegram channel and VKontakte group, where we share even more interesting details and facts that are not included in the episodes. So this story begins in the distant past, when the famous dynasties of Bourbon, Valois, and Capetians did not yet exist, and France and the French were only beginning to take shape. By the way, the French really disliked this page of their history, which was still just emerging because of its bloodthirstiness, the cruelty of the heroes, and all these royal intrigues. The rulers we will discuss in this episode belong to the Merovingian dynasty, and this deserves a more detailed explanation. The heart of France in the 5th century was full of blood and turmoil, and it was during this turbulent time that Merovec emerged, the founder of one of the most mysterious and powerful dynasties in Europe, the Merovingians. The legend of Merovec, his origins and feats, subsequently became surrounded by numerous myths, transforming his figure into an almost mythical one. The name of the dynasty, which will rule the Franks for 3 whole centuries, and leave a significant mark in the history of Europe, is derived from him. According to legend, Merovec was the son of a great sea god, and there is something extraordinary about this. Historians still debate his true origins, but the people of that time believed that his father was a real terrifying male monster. One of the most notable stories about Merovec is his victory over the Suebi tribe, who at that time were terrorizing the lands of the Franks. Merovec, possessing both natural bravery and wisdom, led his troops to a decisive victory, which brought him both glory and respect, not only among the Franks but also from his enemies. According to legend, Merovec used his tactics, which were invisible to his opponents but obvious to his allies. He predicted that the enemies would attack at night and organized his army to meet the attackers fully prepared. Merovec became the ruler of the Franks, uniting tribes that had not previously been in conflict with each other. This unification was certainly not easy, and many tribes resisted. But Merovec was able to somehow establish these relations and create a stable state. The legend of Merovec also describes his personal life as one full of intrigues and dramatic events. Apparently, this was generally passed down as a legacy among the Franks. It is said that he had several wives and mistresses, and his relationships with them often became a source of conflict and tension. But what he generally wanted, if he had several wives, I do not know. However, despite all these personal difficulties, Merovec was still able to leave behind a strong state and dynasty that would later rule France for the next several centuries. After Merovec's death, his heirs continued the work of their great ancestor. His descendants, known as the Merovingians, ruled France for the next 3 centuries. By the way, a distinctive feature of the Merovingians was their long hair and thick beards, which became their symbol in the 6th century. In terms of behavior, They were hardly different from other Franks and were no more cruel than the Roman rulers of the last centuries. But since their royal power was still unstable at that time, they had to strengthen it through decisive actions. The Merovingians sometimes displayed excessive cruelty, but at times also mercy. Interestingly, the coat of arms of the Merovingians features bees. The bee dynasties became a symbol of power and greatness due to their association with hard work, organization, and royal virtue. And this connection goes deep into ancient times, when bees and hives were considered symbols of order, productivity, and a certain kind of prosperity. It is even believed that the first king of the Franks, Clovis I, wore garments adorned with golden bees, symbolizing his right to rule and divine protection. This legend is also connected to the discovery of more than 300 golden bees in the tomb of Chilperic the Near, the father of Clovis, when his tomb was excavated in 1653. And before we talk about our main characters, it is important to note that we know about all these intrigues thanks to the famous chronicler of this time, Gregory of Tours, and the magical pages of the history of medieval Europe would not be so vivid without his works. Yet he became one of the most outstanding chroniclers of his time. But Gregory of Tours was not just a chronicler. He was also a witness and an active participant in significant historical events. But they certainly did not escape criticism. Contemporaries accused him of bias, for example, when he often criticized women who played prominent roles in politics, including Fredegund and Brunhilda, which led to accusations of antipathy. However, despite the criticism, the works of Gregory of Tours remain a valuable source for studying this complex, dramatic, and multifaceted period of history. But before moving on to the main events, it is important to mention one more significant point regarding the principle of succession among the Merovingians. After Clovis, I eliminated all his competitors among the Frankish kings in the early 5th century. A clear dynastic principle emerged among the Franks. Until now, only the descendants of Clovis through the male line were considered Merovingians. Royal power was passed from father to son, and any young man could claim the throne if he could prove his descent from Clovis and gain the approval of the aristocracy through ritual elections. If a Merovingian king had several sons, the kingdom was usually divided among them, and if the deceased had no descendants at all, his lands would pass to his brothers, or, in their absence, to his paternal uncles. Now we move to the mid-6th century, when vast territories from Bern in the south to Cologne in the north, and from Rennes in the west to Sion in the east, formed a powerful Frankish kingdom under the rule of King Chlothar I of the Merovingian dynasty. By the end of the 6th century, he united the Frankish lands into a single state. And to understand how the subsequent dramatic events unfolded, let us begin this story with the moment of the death of this king. So when King Chlothar died, in 561 his kingdom was divided among his 4 sons, Heribert and Guntram, Sigebert and Chilperic. The first 3 were the sons of Ingund, the first wife of Chlothar the Fil, while Chilperic was the son of Arnegund, the king's second wife. Ingund and Arnegund were biological sisters, and it so happened that both became the wives of one man. Ingund, wishing happiness for her sister, asked her husband to find a worthy spouse for her, but Chlothar seemed to decide that he himself was the best option and took Arnegund as his wife as well. And so, after the death of Chlothar I, the kingdom was divided among his sons, and as often happens, the division was not without conflicts. The conflict was initiated by Chilperic the Page. He may have feared that the official settlement of the kingdom of the Franks would be disadvantageous for him. Nevertheless, he decided to act preemptively. Immediately after the funeral of his father in Soissons, the youngest son of Chlothar I launched a raid on the palace in Bern and seized the royal treasury. The new financial resources allowed him to buy the loyalty of the magnates, and with their support, Chilperic entered Paris, from where he claimed his rights to a portion of the kingdom that had previously belonged to Hildebert the First. Thus, Chilperic did not oppose the division of the kingdom, but at the very least ensured that he had the means to obtain his share. And so Heribert the Merge, Guntram and Sigebert did not want to reconcile with the actions of Chilperic. They united forces to expel him from Paris. After that, the 3 kings themselves conducted the official division of the kingdom. So, here, Gregory of Tours asserts that they divided the kingdom by lot. However, there are still grounds for doubt about this, as the distribution was likely determined by the balance of their powers. The brothers eventually reached an agreement and divided the lands. Haribert I received the kingdom of Paris, Guntram I became the ruler of the kingdom of Burgundy, and Sigebert I led Austrasia. Chilperic, on the other hand, received Neustria, and by the way, he had the weakest kingdom of all. 6 years later, Haribert died. He is believed to have died as a result of divine punishment because throughout his reign he interfered in church affairs, maintained an entire harem, and ultimately married a nun who was also a close relative. Therefore, shortly before his death, he was excommunicated from the church. After his death, the remaining 3 brothers divided his possessions among themselves. Now, let's talk a little about each of them. The second brother, Guntram I, was described by his contemporaries as a very kind-hearted king, although he could show cruelty when necessary. For example, he was ruthless towards relatives who spoke ill of his wife, or even towards doctors who had unsuccessfully treated him. Overall, he was considered a gentle and just ruler, but unfortunately all his wives and sons died, leaving him without direct heirs. Sigebert received territories encompassing modern-day Germany, Belgium, and France, known as Austrasia, with its center in Reims and Metz. He proved himself to be a talented military leader, fighting against the Saxons, capturing lands from the Slavs, and repelling the raids of the Avars. However, for most of the time, Sigebert I struggled with his brothers, each of whom wanted to take a part of his possessions. Thus, to strengthen his position, Sigebert decided to arrange a dynastic marriage. Some sources also mention that he was tired of a life of debauchery and the 18 concubines and decided to turn to the righteous path. And unlike his brothers who married the daughters of vassals or even maidservants, he sent a matchmaker to distant Toledo in Spain. There, King Atenegild had 2 daughters ready for marriage, and the choice fell on the younger of them, Bruna, who, although she was already 23 years old, was still considered a beauty, an intelligent woman, and an educated girl. The Austrasian suitors, having given rich gifts, took the bride to their ruler. Many of the Merovingians married Frankish or Gallo-Roman nobles, and sometimes even commoners, as we have already mentioned, and against this backdrop the royal lineage of Brunhilda was quite honorable for Sigebert V, but the marriage promised him numerous benefits, including a possible military alliance against Byzantium, for example, or intervention in Spanish affairs regarding the succession of the throne of Adonagild. While Sigebert I was consolidating his position in Austrasia, his younger brother Chilperic I was seeking to strengthen his power in Neustria. However, his reign was overshadowed by constant civil wars and conflicts with his brothers. In general, Chilperic I was known for his cruelty and cunning, often resorting to intrigues and conspiracies to maintain his power. But, as I already mentioned, women played a key role in all these killings, so let's talk about them. Bruna was born around the year 543 in the kingdom of Visigoth. The Visigothic kingdom was one of the first feudal states to emerge from the ruins of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century. But let's return to the girl. After she was brought to Sigebert, a problem arose in Reims. Brunhild practiced Arianism, which was considered heresy in Catholic Europe. I would like to clarify that Arianism is one of the early Christian teachings, named after Arius, a presbyter from Alexandria. He was born in the 4th century and claimed that Jesus Christ was not equal to God in his essence, but was created by him and therefore was inferior to him. This doctrine was significantly different from the traditional Christian teaching on the Trinity, which asserted that the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit are of the same essence and equal. And by the way, this teaching was particularly widespread among the Germanic peoples, including the Visigoths, who are being discussed. However, despite his ancestral faith, Bruno agreed to accept Catholicism and the new name Brunhilda, which means warrior clad in armor, for the sake of the crown. By adopting Catholicism, Brunhild made an important political move, demonstrating her loyalty to the new people. And this gesture, of course, strengthened her position in the new home and contributed to the strengthening of the bond between Austrasia and her native kingdom. Fortunately for Sigebert the Man, a significant dowry arrived along with Brunhilda, which was meant to impress the people of Gaul. Her father provided Brunhilda with wealth that she was to preserve in her new home. Her luggage contained numerous outfits and jewelry that undoubtedly matched her status. Atenegild also granted Brunhilda a direct dowry, which remained in any case her personal property. Unlike the world markets, the Viscounts considered this, following Roman law, to be an undoubtedly important element of marriage. And although the exact composition of Brunhild's retinue is unknown, we know that Sigebert the Wise became the ruler of the lands in the Cevennes, which previously belonged to the Visigoths through marriage, and so in 566 Sigebert took her as his wife, strengthening his position and distinguishing himself from his brothers. The wedding of Brunhild and Sigebert in Metz was rightly an event of national significance that must be mentioned. Upon arriving in Austrasia, Brunhild realized that her future husband held her in extremely high regard. Sigebert organized a lavish wedding, inviting all the high-ranking nobles of the kingdoms, the aristocracy, and of course the best poets. Unlike his brothers, he adhered to the principle of monogamy and fidelity after his 18 concubines, but nevertheless, this was very much appreciated by the bishops. And thus, for an outside observer, Brunhilda was beautiful because she was gentle and modest, as a bride should be, but also because she came from a noble family. This wedding served as a sort of publicity for Sigebert II, as the guests began to talk about the beauty of his wife and the fairness of Sigebert. His stakes, in the eyes of his subjects, began to rise. According to tradition, the wedding night was an unchanging part of the wedding ritual. Contemporaries did not miss the opportunity to describe this moment, as the next morning an event of no less importance was taking place, concerning not so much feelings as property. As was customary for a newlywed in the barbarian world, Brunhild received from her husband a morpingaba, which literally means morning gift, given in exchange for her virginity. Depending on the husband's social status, the composition and value of this gift could vary significantly. But in any case, the wife became his full and sole owner. The morning gift often represented a significant portion of the property left to the wife in case she suddenly became a widow. Therefore, it was not advisable to spend it, and prudent wives replenished it over the years from the income of their own estates or through the generosity of, for example, their husbands. Sigebert I, wishing to demonstrate his wealth and emphasize the significance of his marriage to the Visigoth princess, generously gifted his Brunhild. Her luggage and the gifts from Sigebert formed the basis for the collection of precious tableware mentioned in the Queen's will. During her grand feasts, she could use them to showcase the absolutely finest table in the entire kingdom. Thus, Brunhild became the Queen of Austrasia, originally from modern-day Spain, and a princess of the Visigoths. Her beauty and intelligence captivated the hearts of many, but perhaps it was King Sigebert who was most enchanted. Because of him, she became a queen, but her path was not strewn with roses. Brunhild was always a woman of strong character and sharp intellect, which often led to conflicts at court. The marriage of Sigebert Feud and Brunhild was nonetheless successful. Despite the constant wars that distracted Sigebert from a quiet and peaceful family life, Brunhild bore him a son, Hilgebert II, and two daughters, Ingund and Chlodisvinda. Their happy family life aroused the envy of Chilperic, the brother of Sigebert, who ruled Neustria from Paris. Firstly, after the aforementioned grand luxurious wedding, the popularity of Sigebert began to rise sharply, which meant he could push his brother aside in terms of land rights. Secondly, Gregory of Tours also writes that Sigebert inspired Chilperic to lead a righteous life by his example. He was known, as the men said, for his constant orgies at his court, even though he was married to Audovera. Chilperic ultimately exiled his wife to a monastery and lived with her maid, Fredegund. And this Fredegund, the future queen of Neustria, is the brightest and most controversial figure of the early Middle Ages. She was a wild mixture of the refined Rome and Germanic barbarism, and she probably stands alongside Agrippina, the Roman empress who killed her husband. Her story is full of intrigues, betrayals, bloodshed, and resembles the plot of a gripping novel. And here, while telling the story of Fredegund, one cannot help but recall the saying, "From rags to riches." Fredegund was likely born around the year 545 in a humble French family. In general, the name Fredegund translates to peaceful warrior, which later did not correspond at all to her figure, as you will learn more about later. According to some sources, she was the daughter of a poor peasant, while others claim she was even a slave. Her early life is shrouded in mystery, but it is known that she came to the court of King Chilperic I, where she began her career as a maid to his first wife, Queen Audovera. Ambitious and beautiful, Fredegund quickly caught the king's attention. Her ability to adapt and intrigue quickly led her to more significant positions. Soon, she became the mistress of the king and, as it is said, played a key role in the exile of her own queen and mistress, Audovera. However, the path to success was both long and bloody. The story of Fredegund inadvertently resembles the fate of Harem Sultan, who, upon entering the Sultan's harem, became the most powerful woman in the Ottoman Empire. But we will definitely talk about her later. For now, let's return to Fredegund. According to legend, she once persuaded Queen Audovera, in the absence of King Chilperic, to keep their newborn daughter at the baptismal font and to baptize her herself, as at that time there was no suitable and worthy godmother available. And since according to church rules a woman could not marry the child whose baptism she had performed, Audovera, having become the godmother of her own child, automatically lost the right to be the wife of Chilperic. And despite his constant disregard for the fundamental Christian principles, the king was still superstitious, and it was against this very rule that he did not dare to go. And in the end, he expelled the thoughtless Audovera and sent her to a monastery for such a violation of customs. But Fredegund also faced losses. Envious of his brother's happiness, the king decided to remove his mistress and marry Gallisvinta, the eldest daughter of Atanagild and the sister mentioned by Brunhilda. Chilperic, following the example of his brother, sent an embassy to the Visigoths to request the hand of Gallisvinta. However, it was not so simple. Atanagild had already heard that Chilperic had several concubines of low birth, although this was common among the Frankish kings of nobility. And despite Chilperic's promises to marry a woman of royal blood, the negotiations dragged on until 567, when Chilperic's older brother Sigebert I died. After the division of his inheritance, Chilperic received Limoges, Kogor, Bordeaux, and several districts in the Upper Pyrenees, becoming the closest neighbor of the Visigothic king. This already accelerated the marriage with Gallisvinda. In the same year, Chilperic married her in Rouen, promising to grant new lands as a dowry and to end his relationship with the concubine Fredegund, with whom he had previously lived. And so the wedding took place, and now the two brothers were married to the sisters. However, unlike Sigebert, Chilperic's family life was far from ideal. One of the darkest chapters in the life of Fredegund was her struggle against the new queen Galsvinta. Being the daughter of the Visigoth king Atanagild, she still knew her worth and was a noble and influential woman. The enemy was supposed to strengthen the positions of Chilperic and his kingdom, but Fredegund saw it as a threat to herself. Like her sister, Gallisvinda was an Orian, so she also had to convert to Western Christianity. She was crowned, becoming the lawful wife of Chilperic. However, she constantly complained to the king about his neglect and the oppression from Fredegund, who was ultimately returned to the court. Under the influence of Fredegund, Gallisvinda felt utterly insulted and was even considering returning to Toledo. But in 568, a major scandal erupted between the spouses. Gallisvinta literally begged the king to let her go home, promising to leave him even all her dowry. But according to some sources, to avoid the scandal from becoming public, Chilperic ordered her to be killed in her sleep. Or, according to other sources, it is said that suspicions of the murder of Galsvinta immediately fell on Fredegund, who simply managed to avoid punishment and achieve her desires. Either way, Galsvinta was dead. Chilperic mourned for a full 9 days, as was customary, and married Fredegund. By doing so, she eliminated the queen and strengthened her position in the kingdom by removing 2 queens. Soon she gave birth to a child, but he did not live to see 3 years. She blamed the prefect and several women for his death, accusing them of witchcraft. And by tradition, they were executed by breaking on the wheel and burning. This case became the first known example of execution by burning for witchcraft. Fredegund had a total of 6 children, but only 2 of them survived to adulthood. Motherhood was certainly not easy for her. For instance, her relationship with her daughter Regund was particularly strained. Regund inherited many character traits from her mother, and there was certainly no talk of any parental respect. She constantly reproached Fredegund for her low birth and threatened to send her into servitude, which drove her mother into a furious rage. Riguta also constantly told her mother that she was the daughter of the king, while Fredegund was merely a maid, and according to reports, their quarrels were very frequent and tumultuous. At a young age, Regund was betrothed to one of the Visigoth princes and sent to Spain. While she was making her way to Spain in 584, after receiving news of her father Chilperic's death, her own people robbed the girl. Consequently, the wedding was called off and she returned home. Moreover, the question of loyalty arose. No one wanted to take a dowry-less woman as a wife. They fought, publicly slapped each other, and insulted one another. At some point, Fredegund's patience snapped, and she suggested to Regund that they live separately. The girl refused the proposal, but in return her mother offered her the treasures of her father, and Regunde agreed. And here is how a historian of that time describes these events. She was already tired, and let her take whatever comes to hand. And when she lowered her hand into the chest and began to take out things, Fredegund grabbed the lid of the chest and sharply brought it down on the back of her daughter's head, and she pressed down on the lid with such force that the lower edge pressed so hard on her daughter's throat that, according to witnesses, her eyes were about to pop. And one of the girls who was there shouted loudly for help, pleading to save the lady, for God's sake, because her own mother was choking her. But after that, the hostility between mother and daughter intensified even more, especially because Rekunda willingly indulged in debauchery and tarnished the already questionable reputation of their family. The quarrels and fights between them lasted until the death of Fredegund in 597. Either way, the marriage of Chilperic to the former servant led to a long and bloody feud between Fredegund and Brunhilda, the Queen of Austrasia. The murder of Galiswinta became the starting point of the legendary war between the two queens. Brunhilda, who loved her sister, convinced her husband to declare war on the Neustrians in response to the betrayal, and this marked the beginning of the dynastic conflicts between the supporters of Fredegund and Brunhilda, which engulfed the continent for the next 50 years. And the reasons for blood vengeance grew more and more each year. In 569, at the initiative of King Guntram, a judicial popular assembly was held, and by the way, at that time the popular assembly represented a kind of synthesis of Germanic traditions and the ancient republic. It was decided at the meeting that Chilperic, guilty of the murder of Galiswinta, should pay compensation to Brunhilda, her sister, in the form of a wedding gift that she never received. The 5 cities by the Quittance, Pordos, Limoges, Cahors, Puy-en-Velay, and Bergara, these were not just cities, they were the largest trading and wealthiest points, the most important centers of trade and movement. Who would want to give them up? No one. Chilperic did not want to. Instead of agreeing, a dispute flared up with renewed strength and lasted for 6 years. Chilperic, unwilling to come to terms with his losses, decided to take the cities of Tours and Poitiers from his brother, which led to new military confrontations. By the way, Poitiers was also the heart of future France. Sigebert, the husband of Brunhilda, began to achieve victories. Soon he was declared king of all the Franks, so Chilperic could not be left alive. In 575, the forces of Austrasia captured Paris, forcing Chilperic and Fredegund to flee, but Fredegund responded with murder. According to the same historian Gregory of Tours, she hired 2 assassins who infiltrated the camp of Sigebert and killed him with poisoned daggers, although they were immediately captured and killed themselves. Brunhilda not only remained a widow, but also fell into captivity in Rouen at the hands of the murderers of her sister and husband. At the last moment, she managed to send her 5-year-old son Hildebert, already proclaimed king, back to Austrasia with a loyal man, and thank God. And so, when Hildebert was killed and left the political arena at the command of Fredegund, Brunhilda found herself at the center of political intrigues. She was not going to back down and set out to fight for her rights and the rights of her children. Brunhilda became the regent for her son Hildebert II and effectively ruled the kingdom. She undoubtedly proved herself to be a talented ruler, capable of holding the threads of power and ensuring stability in her state. The feud between Brunhilda and Fredegund flared up with new intensity, especially after the murder of Sigebert. Brunhilda was undoubtedly thirsting for revenge, and for many years a real war was waged between these two women. Their struggle was not only political but also personal. Each of them sought to destroy the other, using absolutely any means to achieve this. Brunhilda formed alliances, schemed at the courts of her enemies, and sought to regain her power. She even arranged a marriage between her son and the daughter of Chilperic and Fredegund, hoping to negotiate and somehow strengthen her position, but Fredegund was not idle. She continued to weave her treacherous webs, eliminating those who stood in her way. Along with Brunhilda, in exile in Rouen, was also Chilperic's first wife, Odovera. Thus both were victims of Fredegund, and it is possible that they even met and communicated, but there is no concrete evidence for this. In 577, the son of Chilperic and Odovera arrives in Rouen to meet his mother. And it was quite a naive and even a little foolish act, as he was acquainted with Fredegund and knew what she was like, but in any case he arrived. The son was also named Moroveus, and he was a namesake of the legendary Moroveus and the heir to his father's throne. He was raised as a true warrior. In his youth, his father gave him command of the siege of Kotia, and so, upon arriving in Rouen, Merovesh was captivated by the amorous Brunhilda, and although Morove was 7 years younger than her, it was none other than the Bishop of Rouen, Pritixtat, who decided to marry them. Even the fact that the lovers were relatives and such connections were forbidden by the church did not stop anyone at that time. They were still married. During the wedding ceremony, while everyone was enjoying the celebration, Fredegund was organizing an attack. The Proskar hung, her people burst into the hall and began killing all the guests. Panic ensued. Many noble Franks supporting Brunhilda and Sigebert were killed. Mirove barely escaped death himself. Doesn't this story remind you of the Red Wedding in Game of Thrones, where all the guests were also slaughtered, becoming victims of betrayal and the struggle for power? Now you know what event inspired Martin in creating his saga. It is precisely this one. And this bloody wedding became one of the most vivid and horrifying illustrations of the ruthless struggle for power that prevailed at that time. Fredegund brilliantly demonstrated that she was willing to do anything to eliminate her rivals and maintain her power, and as you can guess, the mass slaughter did not calm anyone down but only added fuel to the fire. After the wedding, Merovec became a rebel and a criminal in the eyes of his father and his stepmother Fredegund. His father sent an army against his son simply for getting married. And Murave, realizing that victory was not in his favor, as he had a weak army and was not really capable of opposing his father, committed an act of a Roman. He ordered his friend to stab him with a sword, and the friend, being an obedient servant, carried out the order. And quite predictably, at the conclusion of Murave and Brunhilda, Bishop Pretextat was also killed 9 years later from the wound inflicted on him in the church. Avdovra also, by a twist of fate, died in a monastery. And Gregory of Tours nearly repeated the involvement of Pritextatus when in 580 Fredegund accused him of insults. After all, he described her as a treacherous, cruel woman somehow involved in murders, intrigues, and all those political conspiracies. In his works, especially in the history of the Franks, he actively noted her involvement in the murders of both Galliswinter and Sigebert, as well as her role in numerous crimes. But in the end, he miraculously managed to justify himself before the church council. Bernie gained the trust of the king, becoming his advisor, bypassing Fredegund, and one might think that the divine retribution promised by the Predikstad began to gradually catch up with Fredegund. In 580, two sons of Chilperic and Audoviera died one after the other. The heir became their second son, Chlodwig, and here Fredegund found nothing more outrageous than to declare that this Chlodwig, the heir, was guilty of witchcraft, and it was he who used witchcraft against her young children, who died as a result. And from the sources, it is known that there was likely an epidemic at that time, and the children of Fredegund died precisely due to the illness. The concept of sanitation did not exist in the Middle Ages, and there was no medicine as we know it. And so this Chlodwig was exiled, and soon after, he was found dead by chance in exile. Then Fredegund claimed that it was not Chilperic who had cast spells against his children, but the mother of his concubine, and the poor woman was ultimately burned at the stake. 3 days later, another of her sons died. They found again those who were accused of witchcraft against her children and who were once more tortured and exiled. Ultimately, Fredegund wanted power rather than just being the king's wife. Here it creates the impression that Fredegund is a bundle of villainy and murderers who has completely lost her mind. The death of her husband Chilperic in 584 was blamed on her, as she was not only a bloodthirsty woman but also lacked fidelity to her husband. The queen was in love with Landry Hafranski, a nobleman and the major doman of Neustria. And this was such a high-ranking official in the Merovingian kingdom who initially managed the royal palace and its economic affairs, but over time the role of the mayor became significantly expanded, and this position effectively became akin to rulers, controlling many aspects of governance in the kingdom, including both military and administrative functions. Landry Hafranski played a crucial role at the court and was closely involved in political intrigues and manipulations. In historical records, he is mentioned as one of her most loyal associates, actively supporting her ambitions and actions. Contemporaries of the bloodthirsty queen wrote about their alliance, noting that he unusually entered into a union with her, and one day early in the morning the king set out for a hunt to the estate of Chelles, not far from Paris. But out of great love for Fredegund, having stepped away from the groom, he returned once more to her chamber, where she was just washing in the water. The king approached her from behind and slapped her in one place. Thinking it was Landry, she said, "What are you doing there, Landry?" And turning around and seeing that it was actually the king himself and not her lover, she became quite frightened. The king was very saddened and went off to hunt. Fredegund sent for her lover and told him everything. "Chilperic, I was killed." In 584, under certain mysterious circumstances, he was stabbed with a knife during a hunt. Historians, of course, believe that Fredegund may have been involved in his murder, as she had a reputation for being a woman capable of such treacherous and cruel acts. It is quite possible that she saw the removal of Chilperic Wam as her chance to strengthen her personal power and secure a future for her son Chlothar too, as she desires. And perhaps her husband hindered Fredegund from fully reuniting with her lover, or she simply feared the revenge of Chilperic the Fern against his unfaithful wife for her infidelity. Nevertheless, the question of who killed Chilperic remains, still controversial. Many modern historians believe that Fredegund understood that if Chilperic died, she would have no chance of securing the throne other than being a regent for the ruler. But the situation was further complicated by the fact that Brunhilda's position began to improve. Firstly, she fled to Metz, where she demanded that her little son Sigebert be recognized as the king of Australia. Secondly, she asked for protection from Guntram so that he would take her nephew under his patronage and recognize all his rights. He agreed and, according to some sources, even adopted Chilperic II. And now this little boy was considered not only the ruler of Austrasia but also the heir to Burgundy, which belonged to Guntram. The main state officials agreed with the position of Chilperic. In these circumstances, Fredegund realized that as soon as this boy grew up, her position would be very unenviable. Therefore, she wanted to have a child. And so it happened that 4 months before the death of Chilperic Van, she gave birth to a son and named him Guntram. Nevertheless, some historians still suggest that perhaps this child was not from the king, but from her lover Landry Hafransky. And here one might want to ask for sure, but will divine retribution catch up with her after all? She has new children, and she does not give up. After the death of Chilperic Fur, Fredegund defends the rights of her infant son, who was only 4 months old. Initially, another brother of Chilperic VI, Guntram, was proclaimed regent. Fredegund, as Brunhilda had requested, asked him to recognize her son's legitimate rights to the throne and to become his regent as well. However, Guntram stated that he does not believe this Hopper is his own nephew. Then she said that she is ready to stand before God's judgment and solemnly swear before all the bishops that this is indeed the son of Chilperic. On this occasion, a gigantic assembly of 700 people was gathered, consisting of bishops and nobles, before whom Fredegund knelt and swore that this was the son of Chilperic the Fay. At that time, Guntram was forced to provide patronage to his supposed nephew. At this moment, the chances of Brunhilda and Fredegund were practically equal. The childless King Guntram was courted by one side or the other. Ultimately, he established Chlothar II, also making him the heir to the Burgundy of Orléans. And after the death of Guntram, the question of the inheritance of his lands became particularly prominent. How Guntram passed away is unknown. He simply stopped being written about, despite the fact that he was the regent of the ruler. But as it goes, it is believed that he was also killed on the orders of course, Fredegund, as she is still the main villainess in this story. Furthermore, the hatred between Brunhilda and Fredegund manifested in their incitement of their sons to attack each other's territories. Fredegund tried to overthrow Brunhild, or at the very least, kill her son. Brunhild was not far behind and did the same. These women began to settle their differences through their sons, keeping them on a short leash. Both sons reached adulthood at the age of 15 and even got married, but neither of them played a significant role or took any independent actions. It even came to the point that Fredegund and Brunhild were independently convening councils. It came to the point that they themselves determined the plans and signed peace treaties. And amusingly, the treaties were signed by the wives of their sons rather than by the sons and heirs themselves. Sigebert, on the other hand, turned out to be more independent and self-reliant, unlike Chlothar II, who was completely under the control of his mother Fredegund. This, of course, did not work in his favor. At the age of 28, Hildebert died, and some believe that it was not without the help of Brunhild, who had grown tired of her independent son. He left behind 2 boy heirs. One was 10, the other 6, and both sons were very small, which allowed Brunhilda to become regent and easily govern them now. Nevertheless, state officials and envoys went directly to Brunhilda and Fredegund when addressing any issues. Queens officially ruled the states. Fredegund fought until the end of her life, which came in 597. She was about 61 years old. Her death caused a lot of noise and gossip. Many believed that she was a witch and did not actually die. So she set off on a flight or simply vanished. However, Brunhild did not end up so well. Although she did not scheme and plot like Fredegund, her demise was extremely tragic. In the last years of her life, she spent her time in conflict with her grandchildren. As the grandchildren grew up, they wanted to reign, and at first she quarreled with one of the older grandsons, then went to stay with her younger favorite grandson, but even he received his grandmother without much enthusiasm and tolerated her for a long time. But ultimately, as a result of yet another conflict, the grandson revealed Brunhilda, dissatisfied with her power. He thought that his grandmother had already overstayed her time in power, as even by medieval standards she was indeed elderly, being over 70 years old. Nevertheless, sources state that she maintained both an impressive appearance and a good figure, as well as an energetic lifestyle into her old age. However, in the end he handed her over to the barons and aristocracy, who did not hesitate and sent her to Chlothar II, the son of Fredegund, who hated her with all his heart. Moreover, he understood that Brunhild was the last obstacle between him and the conquest of the entire kingdom. When she fell into his hands, he accused her of having contributed to the demise of a large number of Frankish kings, around 30. Indeed, it is not entirely clear where he found so many kings, but still Brunhilda was accused of it. Such a serious accusation against the queen was part of Chlothar's larger plan, as he intended to arrange a public execution. Despite being the queen of the Franks, Chlothar II had not the slightest respect for her. She was stripped naked, tied by her hair, one arm and one leg to an unbroken horse, and the horse was struck with a whip and set free. She ran over the stones and cliffs, and when she finally managed to stop the horse, there was practically nothing left of Brunhild. Her body resembled torn rags. She died an incredibly terrible death. This happened in 610. Thus, the confrontation between Brunhilda and Fredegund came to an end. After her death, Brunhild became the heroine of the epic song of the Nibelungs. There she is depicted as a Valkyrie of Scandinavian origin who somehow sinned and ended up on Earth. Eventually, she did marry King Gunther. The plot of the Song of the Nibelungs also includes the marriage of Brunhild to King Gunther. To win her over, Gunther was assisted by Siegfried, who concealed his true identity and donned an invisibility cloak. With his help, Gunther defeats Brunhild in the contests, and she agrees to marry him. However, soon a conflict arises between Brunhild and Kriemhild, the wife of Siegfried, brother of Gunther. It is Kriemhild who reveals that it was Siegfried, not Gunther, who defeated Brunhild, which deeply offends and humiliates her. And this conflict becomes the catalyst for subsequent tragic events, including the murder of Siegfried and the vengeful actions of Kriemhild, leading to the demise of many characters. In this same Song of the Nibelungs, Brunhild embodies a blend of such strength, pride, and tragic vulnerability that makes her one of the most memorable and complex characters of the epic, which you have surely heard of. And while Brunhild is depicted in heroic sagas as a Valkyrie and a positive character, Fredegund usually appears in literature as an evil witch or sorceress, nothing else. The final chapter of the story of Brunhild and Fredegund is an epic saga of power, betrayal, cruelty, and an unquenchable thirst for control, characteristic not only of our contemporary heroines, but also of many other rulers throughout history. The lives and actions of these queens, the war between the former maid and the noble Visigoth princess, whose chances were equalized by their marriages and sons, left an indelible mark on the history of the French kingdom, as well as created myths, legends, and lessons for future generations. Although, unlike Fredegund, the ambitions and intentions that initially promised nothing good for anyone, neither for her family nor for the state. Brunhild, on the other hand, sought to stabilize and strengthen the royal power. She was quite a talented administrator and reformer, striving to improve both justice and the governance of the state. However, her desire for centralization of power and her driven wish for revenge for the murder of her husband and sister made her a target for numerous enemies and her own actions. This conflict, known as the Royal Battle, stretched over several decades. In the end, both queens tragically perished. Brunhilda, as we said, was captured and brutally executed by the order of Chlothar II, the son of Fredegund, and Fredegund, although she died earlier, left her son a kingdom beset by terrible bloody feuds. After the death of Brunhilda, Chlodrev II united the French lands under his rule, but this unification was very unstable. The constant wars, ongoing intrigues, and the weakening of royal power contributed to the strengthening of the local nobility and the mayors, the highest officials of the royal court. Against the backdrop of this decline, a new powerful player soon emerged on the political stage. Pepin of Herstal, the mayor of the Palace of Austrasia. Pepin is a skilled strategist and politician who began to gradually concentrate power in his hands, effectively ruling the kingdom and leaving the kings with only nominal authority. His son Charles Martel continued this policy, strengthening his influence and preparing the ground for the final seizure of power. By the mid-8th century, the Merovingian dynasty had completely lost its power. The last of the Merovingian kings, Chilperic III, was deposed by the short-haired son of Charles Martel, who became the first king of the new Carolingian dynasty. From this moment, a new era began in the history of the French kingdom. The fall of the Merovingian dynasty was the result of internal strife, the weakening of central authority, and the rise of the power of local nobility and mayors of the palace. Their story serves as a vivid example of how ambitions, intrigues, and infighting can lead to the downfall of a great dynasty and significant changes in the political landscape of an entire state. Today's episode turned out to be quite bloody and definitely ambiguous. If you found it interesting to spend this time with me, be sure to subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications so you don't miss new videos, and until we meet again, dear friends.